The words were stones in Eliza Thorne's throat, but she spat them out one by one. "I thank you for the consideration, Mr. Holt, but I have no need of a husband." She stood on her own porch, the warped planks groaning under her boots, her hands clenched on the railing she'd repaired herself last spring. Before her, Silas Holt sat astride his steady bay horse, his shadow long and thin in the late autumn sun. He was a plain man, his face weathered by the same Dakota wind that chapped her own skin, his hands thick and capable on the reins. He had proposed marriage as one might propose a fence line, a practical joining of two properties for mutual benefit. His quarter section had the only reliable creek for a mile. Hers had the better grazing land, flat and rich. Together, they would make a viable whole. Separated, they were two halves of a hardship. "My answer is no," she repeated, her voice sharper this time, daring him to argue, to cajole, to do what every other man would do, and try to wear her down. Silas Holt did none of those things. He simply watched her, his gaze level and unhurried. It was the quietest gaze she had ever met. It did not assess her worth as a woman, nor her value as a potential wife. It simply saw her. "I understand, Miss Thorne," he said, his voice a low burr that the wind couldn't quite carry away. "It is a practical matter, nothing more. A man needs a wife to prove up on a full section. A woman alone needs water when the winter freeze comes for her well. The facts will remain, whether you say yes or no." He didn't sound disappointed or angry. He sounded like a man stating the time of day. He gathered his reins, his movements economical and sure. "The offer stands," he said, not to her but to the vast, indifferent sky between them. "Should the facts change your mind?" He turned his horse and rode away. Eliza stood gripping the railing, her knuckles white, watching him recede into the golden dust. She had braced for a fight, for persuasion, for pity. She had received only a quiet statement of truth, and it left her feeling strangely unsteady, as if a step she'd been certain of had found no ground beneath it. The cold air bit at her cheeks, a promise of the facts to come. The first snow fell a week later, a light dusting that melted by noon. The second came with a vengeance, a thick, wet blanket that bowed the branches of the lone cottonwood by her cabin and did not melt. The cold sank its teeth into the land. As Silas had predicted, Eliza's well was the first casualty. One morning, the bucket came up with a skin of ice. The next, it hit the frozen surface with a dull, final thud. For 2 weeks she managed. She melted snow, a laborious process that yielded barely enough for herself and her milk cow, Bess. The water was flat and tasted of soot. Then the real cold arrived, the kind that froze a man's breath in his beard and made the very timbers of her cabin groan in protest. There was no more snow to melt, only a hard, glittering crust over the prairie. Pride was a poor substitute for water. After 2 days of a dry throat and a lowing, miserable cow, Eliza bundled herself in every layer she owned and began the 2-mile trek to Murky Spring, hauling 2 empty buckets. The water there was brackish, and the effort of the journey left her gasping in the thin, frigid air, her body aching with a cold that went bone deep. She did this for 5 days. On the morning of the 6th, exhausted and dreading the walk, she opened her door to a world of blinding white and saw them. 2 full barrels of water standing just on her side of the dilapidated fence that marked their property line. Steam rose faintly from their surfaces, indicating they had been filled from Silas Holt's creek, not a frozen well. There was no note, no sign of him, Just the water, a gift without witness. Eliza stared, her throat tightening with something other than thirst. She hauled the barrels to her cabin, her mind a turmoil of gratitude and resentment. The next day, after using the clean, sweet water, she baked an extra loaf of bread, wrapped it in a clean cloth, and left it on the fence post where the barrels had been. When she returned from her chores, it was gone. A silent trade began. Every 3 days, 2 barrels of water would appear. Every 3 days, a loaf of bread or a jar of her pickled beets would take their place. They never saw each other. But she found herself watching from her window. She saw him chopping wood, his axe strokes falling with a relentless, metronomic rhythm. She saw him tending his small herd, his movements calm and deliberate, even in the biting wind. He was not a man of grand gestures, but of infinite, consistent habits. He did what needed to be done. Day after day, he was as reliable as the sunrise, and just as quiet. She told herself it was a practical arrangement, an extension of his first offer. Water for bread. A neighborly transaction in the face of a brutal winter. But as the weeks wore on, the sight of the full barrels brought a relief that felt dangerously close to hope. The silence between their cabins, once a symbol of her fierce independence, now felt like a shared space, a quiet understanding that spanned the frozen ground. The blizzard hit in mid-January without warning. It came screaming out of the north, a solid wall of white that erased the world. For 2 days, Eliza was a prisoner in her cabin, the wind a physical force against the walls. On the 3rd morning, she woke to a profound and unsettling silence. The wind had died. The world was buried. She fought her way out the door through a drift that had piled against it, and her heart sank. The roof of the small lean-to where Bess slept had collapsed under the immense weight of the snow. A heavy support beam lay across the cow's back, pinning her. The animal was alive, her eyes wide with terror, her breath pluming in the still Arctic air. Eliza dug frantically, her bare hands quickly becoming numb. The beam was immense, half buried and frozen in place. She heaved with all her strength, her muscles screaming in protest, but it wouldn't budge. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her. Bess was her livelihood, her only companion. Losing her was unthinkable. There was only one thing to do. She stumbled back into the cabin, her hands shaking so badly she could barely work the action on her rifle. She shoved 2 cartridges in, stepped back outside, and fired twice into the crystalline air. The shots were unnaturally loud in the muffled silence, a desperate prayer sent into the void. She waited. 1 minute. 5. The cold was a physical pain now, and a terrible despair began to settle over her. Perhaps he hadn't heard. Perhaps he thought it was a hunter. Perhaps he simply wouldn't come. Then, a shape emerged from the white expanse to the east. A tall figure on snowshoes, moving with that same steady, unhurried pace. Silas Holt. Relief washed over her so intensely it made her dizzy. He didn't speak when he reached her, just took in the scene with a quick, efficient glance. "Get a rope," he said, "and the pry bar from my sled." They worked for nearly an hour in the crushing cold. He showed her how to rig the rope for leverage, how to find the purchase point with the pry bar. Their hands brushed as they worked, his rough and calloused, hers clumsy with cold. At one point, as they strained together against the beam, the terrified cow let out a comical, gargling moo that was half groan, half complaint. A small, surprised laugh escaped Eliza's lips, a puff of white in the air. Silas glanced at her, and for a second, the corner of his mouth lifted in a ghost of a smile. Finally, with a great cracking sound, The beam shifted. They worked it free, and Bess scrambled to her feet, shaken but apparently unharmed. The crisis was over. "You should get inside," Silas said, his voice rough. "Warm yourself." She led the way, her body trembling with cold and adrenaline. Inside the small cabin, the heat from the stove was a welcome shock. She busied herself making coffee, her back to him, acutely aware of his presence filling the small space. He stood by the fire, his hat in his hands, melting snow dripping from his coat onto her clean-swept floor. The silence that fell was different from the comfortable quiet of their unspoken arrangement. This was charged, intimate. He had come when she called. He had saved what was hers. He had not said, "I told you so." He had not mentioned his offer. He had simply answered her need. She turned to hand him a mug of coffee, and her eyes met his. In the warm, flickering light of the cabin, she saw it clearly for the first time, the deep well of loneliness in his gaze, a reflection of her own. And beneath it, something else. A quiet, steady warmth that had nothing to do with practicality. He drank the coffee, thanked her gravely, and left. Eliza stood at the window and watched him walk away until his form was once again swallowed by the vast, white landscape. She sank onto a stool, the borrowed warmth of his presence slowly fading. She had been so proud of her refusal, so certain of her solitary strength. But as she listened to the sound of her own breathing in the empty cabin, a devastating truth settled upon her. When she had fired that rifle, she hadn't just been hoping for help. She had been hoping for him. The spring thaw was slow and muddy, turning the prairie into a mire. The creek on Silas's land swelled, a roaring testament to its reliability. Her own land greened up beautifully, the grasses growing thick and lush. The fence between them seemed more arbitrary than ever. Their silent trade had ended with the thaw, but a new tension had taken its place. One afternoon in late April, she saw him riding toward her cabin, not along the fence line, but directly up her path. He dismounted at her porch, taking off his hat and holding it in both hands. He looked as solid and dependable as ever, but there was a new gravity in his expression. "Miss Thorne," he began, his eyes fixed on a point just past her shoulder. "I've come to tell you I'll be riding to Promise Creek tomorrow. From there to Deadwood to file my final patent papers." Eliza's heart gave a strange, painful lurch. She said nothing, waiting. "The land agent is a stickler for the rules," Silas continued, his voice even. "To claim the full section, a man must be the head of a family, married or with a dependent. I am neither." He finally met her